Welcome to the Neighborhood Law Center. I'm your host, Melvin Burruss. And our guest today is Chief Brackney, PhD, of the Charlottesville Police Department. Our topic today is, let's reimagine policing in our community. Welcome, Chief. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's good to see you.
Oh, yeah. Could you just tell our audience a little bit about yourself, your background, why you became a police officer with such a background and experience that you have and everything else?
So the interesting thing is I didn't have any experience when I first started in policing. As a matter of fact, my majors are not criminal justice. They're in public policy, public management, they're in education. So just the opposite, I had very little experience. But in the early 80s, particularly for people of color, black and brown people, those jobs, civil service jobs that had benefits and pensions, were where a lot of our community led us to. So if you were in policing, or the post office was always a great place you were trying to get, with a local, transit authority or something of that nature, union jobs. And that's what my mother pushed me towards in the early 80s. And she would bring home all these applications for civil service protected jobs to try and think about our future and ensuring our future. And literally, I fell into it. They were one of the first jobs that called me. And they were looking for women and minorities when I started in the early 80s. Started in the profession and fell in love with the profession, and am still very much enthralled and excited about the work. As it's taken me from Pittsburgh to, D.C. and then here to Charlottesville.
Were you a foot soldier on the beat?
Oh,
type policeman?
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't walk in at 21 and they decided to make me chief. I'm still trying to wait for that position back in Pittsburgh as chief of police. Has not occurred.
Okay.
So I worked my way up through understanding the profession, being involved in the community, and seeing where the community was hurting and how I might be able to help with that. So my first job was walking a beat. Eventually worked these wagons that you see from back in the 80s that look like ice cream trucks. Was promoted quickly to a sergeant, lieutenant, and commander based on my work ethic, my testing, and my commitment to the job. So I worked every position before I made it through those ranks.
Well, that's great because you have a broad background on what should happen as a police officer, what policing should be based on your experience. Well, let's talk about that. Let's reimagine policing in our community. What would you do as far as community policing is concerned, as far as walking the beat is concerned, and those other issues that come up?
So for me, we talk a lot about reimagining policing. What I think more about is how do you imagine it for the first time so it meets the needs of the community, right? We have romanticized and nostalgicized walking the beat. We would hear people say all the time, oh, I remember that beat officer. And I felt like I had a connection with the beat officer. And my response is, well, is the community the same type of community that was existing at the time that beat officer existed? And you'll find out that wasn't true, right? We now have very transient communities. Communities aren't invested in community the same. Oftentimes we can go decades and not know our next door neighbor, their name, what they do, what they care about. We don't look out for each other the same way. So for me, imagining policing is one in which we have this co-production of public safety, where we're all the persons who are responsible for the well-being of the community, the wellness of the community. That could include officers being more present, but the first thing we have to do is decide what we want policing to look like. And I think we're struggling with that. What is the role of police in our society? So to imagine or reimagine it would first be to define what that means and then how we get there. We can't use the traditional models any longer. We must think about well-being, healthy, thriving communities, and how police might be a part of that and not the overseer and I use that word intentionally, of how people behave in the community. It is a shared authority and shared responsibility for a healthy, thriving community. And that may mean decoupling police from what society has asked us to do and creating resources and capacity for the community to help police and heal itself.
Okay, we start with the premise, protect and serve. Now, people are now talking about maybe we shouldn't, especially with the increase in violence we had talked about before and shootings that's occurred, because some of the victims seem to have mental defects and maybe don't need a police officer, or should we train our police officers in how to handle mental people who are in this situation with them? Or do we have a separate department, which some Minnesota's doing right now, where police do not come in contact with every situation? It depends on what the occurrence is at that time.
Right, so you remember I started out saying we need to define what we want the police to do. Mm-hmm. If we do not want police to be involved or managing those persons who are experiencing a mental health crisis in which they're not engaged in any criminal activity, then we should have a co-responder model in which people are comfortable leveraging that system. We currently don't have that. Not only don't we have it, even if we had the resources, let's say we had $1 million today in Charlottesville for a co-responder model, and we just took that money and put it into a bucket somewhere. Mm-hmm. Do we have the capacity to meet the need, right? We assume just because you have resources, you have capacity, and we don't. So where are we going to take an individual who is experiencing a mental health crisis, who are managing mental illness on a daily basis? What is that location we take them to? We currently don't have beds that we can take them to. We have no 24-hour urgent care like we would say for a Med Express that we can take someone to who is experiencing a mental health crisis, and maybe we should. So do we have the capacity to create the system for mental wellness and mental health care as we dismantle or decouple policing from those societal responsibilities? And that is a much more difficult conversation.
So where does this start? Does it start not in the police department, but does it start with city council? Does it start with the state? Where does the initiative comes from?
I think it first has to start with the state, and let me tell you why. Because we currently have state laws and statutes that say it's the police who are the persons who serve those temporary detention orders or emergency custody orders, and that they do the transports, and that they stay with them as they go from, say, the emergency room to a facility where they're attempting to be stabilized. These interactions could take up to 72 hours when an officer is just sitting with an individual who's in crises. What kind of system creates even more stress or more crises? The officer is not equipped to do that, and is that what we want as society our officers to do, right? So we need to take some responsibility. Take that out of the legislature so that we are not the persons who are mandated by law to have those interactions. We keep taking the easy way out, and then we're surprised when we have the outcomes that we have. And then often we ask for the persons who we believe are the problem to come up with a solution. Often they'll say to me as a policing professional, will you find the solution for how you decouple law enforcement? There's a component of it that says that we enforce the laws. If this society does not want police involved, then they need to hold their elected officials to that standard and wind back that legislature that puts us right in the middle of an area where we should not be embedded to start with.
Okay, so let's start talking about training or recruitment and training of our police officers, because evidently they're not trained, as you're saying, to be a co-responder with mental defects. So how do we, or what do you think we should be doing a new model for recruitment, a new model for training our officers?
So again, I have to start with us defining and agreeing upon what are those services we want of our police department. If we do not want certain services, then we shouldn't be training to that level, right? We need to train to the level of what they want us to do. You know, we hear everyone say that police officers are the social workers, they're the mental health professionals, they're the educators, the mentors. We want them out in the street doing community programming. We want them to answer the 911 call. We want them then to solve the crime. We want them to reduce the crime. We want them to walk the beat. We want them to check your doors at night. We want prevention. We want all of these other things, and they're just not resourced nor trained to that level to be good at this, right? We understand in most professions, as an architect, you know, we don't ask an architect to then figure out how to address the psychological needs or to treat cancer, but we expect that of our public safety first responders. Now, training is always important because we still have to do a job. And what we're finding around our training is, our training, do we have biases that are in part of the training, even implicitly, or have these outcomes? I think there's the ability for us to rethink training in so many ways so that the training is relevant to the work that they do and that it also changes behaviors around not only just de-escalation, non-escalation. You know, so we talk about de-escalation, the situation is already one that is volatile. What about the training that says, how do you go in it so that you, the police officer, don't escalate the situation? Those are the kinds of things that we need to do. Part of that is through our hiring and our screening, and then also how we hire and how we screen. There aren't always the tools that you can have at your disposal. A lot of them are cost prohibitive. We give our officers psychological examinations, and we do the behavioral analysis and what maybe their propensity is for these. They're often very expensive, and particularly they're expensive at a time where people are saying to reduce our budgets. So where do we want to reduce it? Is it on the pre-screening, the application, and the training? We don't think these things through to see what that impact is of some of those upfront decisions.
Well, most of this, the bias in recruiting, because some of our candidates have a bias before they get here. And how do you identify or try to identify whether these people have the aptitude and the bias for the job? Right.
So in Charlottesville, our motto is service beyond the call, beyond the 911 call, beyond the call of duty. Through our screening, we attempt to screen out. But as we all know, there are a lot of things that you cannot screen out for. So part of our background checks are the things that help us through our social media to see if a person, what groups or organizations they affiliate with or associate with as well. But we all have both, you know, implicit or explicit biases. The key is, are those the things that will be detrimental to the way that you perform your work? And that is so important when we talk about policing and biases that occur. One of the things we have to do is distinguish between bias and racism, right? As soon as you say a person has a bias, the first instinct is, I'm not a racist. And those are very different things. We may have a bias towards the communities that we grew up in. You know, I'm very fond of, you know, communities that remind me of mine at home, right? So I have an affinity or an affection for that. We're trying to exclude those biases that inform the way a person behaves. And the way you do that is through not only training, but studies are showing officers who have more formal education are less likely to use force or excessive force. And that correlation is between their competencies and feeling confident in their competencies that don't necessarily translate to using weapons or tools, you know, like a taser or pepper spray or a baton, because we can have that conversation, right? We have the ability to critically think differently because you're often trained in school to think critically about issues. Okay. And I think that's where we need to move towards.
Great. Okay. So let's now get to something that's we talked about before, the George Floyd Policing Act. Could you give me your perspective on that? First, could you give us a background for the audience so they'll know what we're referring to?
Right, so it's the Justice in Policing Act, and it was named after George Floyd, who died at the hands of Derek Chauvin, who is now convicted of his homicide, of his murder. And the concept is that we have officers who are not civilly liable for their egregious acts or their criminal acts, and that's qualified immunity, and they're talking about rolling back qualified immunity and what that may look like. It's standardizing and banning certain behaviors across departments, no chokeholds and things of that nature. It also looks like at standardizing even a pool of personnel, creating standardized or national databases for tracking officers who have been accused of misconduct. And there's a lot to it, right, that you really can pull out of the Justice in Policing Act. It was actually co-sponsored by Karen Bass out of California with now Vice President Kamala Harris after the death of George Floyd. Okay. And there's a lot of pushback back and forth as to what this can mean and will it stifle recruitment and the abilities for officers to do their jobs on an everyday basis. Okay.
We'll take a quick break. This is Melvin Burruss with Neighborhood Law Center. And our host is, as you can see, Chief Brackney, PhD, of the Charlottesville Police Department. And our topic today is let's reimagine policing in the community. Now, could you give us your perspective on the George Floyd Act?
So I am a heavy proponent and advocate of these type of initiatives. As a matter of fact, some of the things that they're asking for, we've been very public about and transparent about here in Charlottesville before the events of May 25th, I believe it was. It'll be a year now when George Floyd died. I am a proponent of it. We have it in our policies, the duty to intervene, which is a part of those. And we also have in our policies, went one step further. When we see an officer engaging in misconduct, including criminal acts, not only the duty to intervene, the duty to report that, right? Most places stop at just the duty to intervene, and you think you've done the work. I am a proponent of that. I believe in national standards. I believe in national training standards. I believe in national qualifications, not only for police officers, but for departments. You can just create a police department if your town, county, or municipality has the resources and the political desire to do that. There are no systems in place that says yes or no, you can do that. We have permitting if you want to add a business. Or if you want to add, liquor licenses to it. But if you want to set up a police department, you can do that. You just then have to fall under your local post commission's training standards to keep them accredited.
Okay, let's talk about the database and certifications. Give us your idea, your knowledge, or your opinion, not your opinion, but how you feel about certifications and terminating a police officer's certification if they have found it about to be misconduct.
So actually, USC, under Dr. Earl Suthers and the SEI Institute, has created already a database where departments can voluntarily put in that database through public information, officers they know who have been terminated or possibly resigned in lieu of termination to avoid the termination. This is a profession. We should be held to the highest standards here. And our failure to do so undermines the profession. There should not be a single officer or a single chief who is interested in a officer who's come from another community in which they violated the trust of that community. I don't think our decertification process really meets the needs of the community. You often have to be convicted of the crime in order to be decertified, and exhausted your entire appeals process. So if you have an officer who resigns before they're entered into a system, or they resign and there's not enough probable cause to convict them of the crime, they stay certified. So every officer that I have terminated in Charlottesville, I present to DCJS, the Department of Justice, the Criminal Justice oversight body here in Virginia, for decertification. And I force them to tell me that they're not going to decertify them. So you then now put it out in the public forum, our willingness to do that, but then you can then expose the gaps in the system where officers can use those gaps and those back doors and those loopholes to stay employed or to stay certified.
So it's up to, the question I was going to ask you is, who's responsible, or who can send this notice get this notice into the database? Can it be an ordinary citizen, or does it have to come from the head of the department of that law enforcement person?
So if you're talking the one that USC is setting up under Dr. Earl Southers, anyone can bring information to them that's out of the public realm that they can put in the database and then attach all of the open source information. For DCJS, right, the oversight who would then decertify the officer, so they could not be employed in Virginia, the organization, that agency, the chief has to send that forward for that official decertification to occur.
Okay, so what is there a word of what, because this is not happening. Every police chief, especially, does this apply to sheriffs also, I should ask? Because as you know, sheriffs are elected by the community or the public. Are they under the same rule, the body?
Yeah, they still have to be certified. They still are a law enforcement, so you still have to be certified. The sheriff is the only one who is the elected. The individuals that are underneath them are not. They're employees, so they're covered under the same processes. The sheriff, if someone was looking to have him decertified, that would probably have to come from, the community or the constituency or someone else for that misconduct. And I would imagine that would come from your local officials pushing that decertification process.
Well, I'm talking about his deputies, I guess.
Anyone underneath him, the sheriff would have the opportunity to have them decertified.
Or the public can send notice or put them into this database. I'm not sure.
So there's two different things we're talking about. One is a database in which there's a push under the Justice and Policing Act, as well as the University of Southern California, USC, right?
Right.
That is a database in which this legislature is pushing for. Decertification database in the individual states, that occurs by someone like myself recommending my officers, or the sheriff or local sheriff recommending their officers. They still have that same authority to do so.
Okay, so we're getting down to the last few minutes.
That has gone quickly for the two of us. Huh?
Well, you've been very interesting, very informative, and very knowledgeable. So it should go fast. You got a lot of experience behind you and knowledge. So let's sum up what you want to leave with the community or with the viewers that we have.
So if we want to imagine what safety and wellness and well-being should look like, we all have to take some responsibility for that, right? We talk about community policing, but we often leave out community as part of the policing, and the responsibility lies strictly with the police. If we want to reduce harm, reduce disorder, reduce violence in the community has to have a stake and a voice in it. There are resources that we can all use together to respond to particularly like in Charlottesville, the shootings and the number of shots fired that are occurring, that is a responsibility we all have. And it just doesn't lie in those communities and where the residents occur or the residents live. I often call out our faith-based community, our social justice and advocacy communities to say, when we coalesce around ideas, let's use that same energy and resources to pour into those communities.
Okay, one quick question.
Sure.
How do you use this civilian review board as a tool, either for the police chief or for the community?
So it depends on what you're trying to use them for. The Police Civilian Review Board currently has the power to engage the community through forums and engagement, town halls. They have that in the ordinance. So I would suggest that we leverage that the community is more than just those persons who might tune into your show. How do we take this show on the road for the more broader community to be involved in it, to have their voices heard, so that we can hear how that we can collaborate together to meet the needs of the community?
Okay. Well, we're running out of time.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your insights. We appreciate it. Again, this is Melvin Burruss with the Neighborhood Law Center, and our guest was Chief Brackney, PhD of the Charlottesville Police. You can see us on the Neighborhood Law Center. Tune in. Or you can go to the YouTube and type in Neighborhood Law Center. Also, we're on channel 13, and so we look forward to seeing you again. And thank you, Chief, for being a guest here. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for your hospitality.
Okay.
It's a pleasure as always.
Okay.